The airport was buzzing with its usual energy. People were rushing around, dragging suitcases, checking their watches, and saying hurried goodbyes to loved ones. Among the crowd stood a young boy, barely 12 years old, gripping a piece of paper in his hand like it was the most precious thing in the world. And for him, it truly was. It was his very first-class ticket, a gift from his dad who had promised him an unforgettable trip to visit family across the country. This wasn't just any ordinary ticket. It symbolized something bigger. For the boy, it meant stepping into a world he'd only seen in movies or heard about in stories. He imagined himself sinking into those wide, comfy seats, sipping on juice served in fancy glasses, and feeling like one of the important passengers he often saw in commercials. Today, he thought, was going to be special. Little did he know how much this day would change his life, and not entirely in the way he expected. Dressed neatly in slacks and a sweater vest, the boy walked up to the gate counter with a huge smile on his face. His excitement was hard to miss. Anyone watching could tell that this kid wasn't used to flying first class. This was clearly a big deal for him. As he approached the gate agent, he held out his ticket proudly, ready to show off what his dad had done for him. But instead of the warm welcome he anticipated, things took a sharp turn. The gate agent glanced down at the ticket and immediately frowned. Her expression shifted from neutral to suspicious within seconds. She picked up the ticket, examined it closely, and then looked back at the boy. Something didn't seem right. To her, or maybe she assumed something about him based on how he looked. Whatever it was, her next move left everyone stunned. "Is this really your ticket?" she asked sharply, her voice colder than before. Before the boy could even respond, she grabbed the ticket, crumpled it slightly, and tore it into pieces right in front of him. The sound of the paper ripping echoed louder in the boy's ears than anything else happening around him. He froze, unable to believe what he was seeing. His dream of flying first class was literally being shredded in front of his eyes. The gate agent muttered something about the ticket being fake or stolen, but the boy barely heard her. All he could focus on was the torn pieces of paper now lying on the counter. Tears began welling up in his eyes as confusion turned to hurt. He tried to explain, stammering through his words. But my dad bought this for me. It's real. I swear." But the gate agent wasn't listening. Instead, she called over security, accusing the boy of trying to use someone else's ticket. Passengers waiting in line started whispering among themselves. Some stared at the boy judgmentally, while others simply watched in silence, unsure of what to think. To them, it must have looked strange. A young boy holding a first-class ticket, standing there crying and insisting it belonged to him. For the boy, the humiliation felt unbearable. He knew deep down that he hadn't done anything wrong, but no one seemed willing to believe him. Every pair of eyes on him made him feel smaller and smaller. Just as security arrived, ready to escort him away, the boy remembered something important, something that might finally prove his innocence. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. With trembling fingers, he dialed a number he knew, by heart. As the call connected, he put the phone on speaker so everyone nearby could hear. On the other end of the line, a calm yet authoritative voice answered. "Hey, champ, how's your flight going?" The voice said warmly. The boy sniffled, trying to hold back tears. Dad, they won't let me board. They said my ticket isn't real." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then, the voice grew serious. "What do you mean? I bought that ticket myself. Who's in charge here?" Before anyone could react, the boy added quietly, almost hesitantly, "And, Dad, you own this airline." Those words hit the room like a bomb. The gate agent froze mid-sentence, her face turning pale. Passengers gasped audibly, and even the security guards exchanged uneasy glances. Suddenly, the entire situation flipped on its head. What had started as a confrontation between a skeptical gate agent and a frightened boy became a moment of reckoning for everyone involved. In that instant, the boy realized two things. First, he understood the power of standing up for himself. Second, he saw firsthand how quickly assumptions can lead to unfair treatment. But more than anything, he learned that sometimes all it takes is courage, and maybe a little help from Dad, to turn a bad situation around. The boy stood there, his heart pounding so loudly he could hear it in his ears. The torn pieces of his ticket lay scattered on the counter like confetti at a party that had gone horribly wrong. His cheeks burned with embarrassment as tears streamed down his face. He felt small, so small, standing in front of all these strangers who were now watching him like he was some kind of troublemaker. The gate agent's accusing tone echoed in his mind. "This isn't your ticket." But how could she say that? How could anyone think he would lie about something like this? His dad had worked hard to give him this experience, to make him feel special. And now, here he was, being treated like he didn't belong, like he wasn't good enough. Security arrived quickly, their presence making the situation feel even more intense. 2 uniformed officers approached, their expressions serious but unreadable. One of them asked the gate agent what was going on, while the other turned to the boy. "Is everything okay here?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already thought the answer was no. The boy nodded frantically, trying to explain himself again. "I'm telling you this is my ticket. My dad bought it for me." But his voice cracked under the weight of his emotions and his words came out shaky and unsure. To the security guards and probably everyone else around him, it probably sounded like he was just making excuses. After all, why would a kid like him have a first-class ticket? The whispers from the crowd grew louder. Some people shook their heads disapprovingly, muttering things like, "Kids these days," or, "He shouldn't be lying about something like this." Others looked sympathetic but stayed silent, unwilling to step in. It was clear that most of them believed the worst about him. But then, the boy remembered something important. Something that might finally prove he wasn't lying. Something that could change everything. With trembling hands, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. His fingers fumbled as he unlocked it and found the contact he needed. His dad's name was right there at the top of his favorites list. He took a deep breath and pressed the call button. As the phone rang, the boy held it up so everyone could hear. On the second ring, a familiar voice answered. "Hey champ, how's your flight going?" His dad's tone was warm and cheerful, completely unaware of the storm brewing at the airport. The boy sniffled, trying to steady his voice. Dad, they won't let me board. They said my ticket isn't real." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then, his dad's voice changed. It became sharper, firmer. "What do you mean? I bought that ticket myself. Who's in charge here?" Before anyone could respond, the boy added quietly, almost hesitantly, "And, Dad, you own this airline." The room seemed to freeze. Every single person within earshot stopped what they were doing and turned their attention toward the boy and the phone. The gate agent's face went pale, her eyes wide with shock. The security guards exchanged awkward glances, unsure of what to say next. Passengers who had been whispering moments ago fell silent, their mouths hanging open in disbelief. For a few seconds, no one moved. The only sound was the faint hum of background noise coming from the phone. Then, the boy's dad spoke again, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable edge of authority. "Let me talk to whoever's in charge right now," he said firmly. "This needs to be sorted out immediately." The gate agent snapped out of her daze and grabbed the phone, her hands visibly shaking. She stammered an apology before handing the device over to her supervisor, who had rushed over after hearing the commotion. By now, the entire scene had drawn a crowd. People craned their necks to get a better look, some filming the incident on their phones while others whispered among themselves. The supervisor took the phone cautiously, nodding as he listened to the boy's father on the other end. Whatever was being said, it was clear that the tone of the conversation had shifted dramatically. The gate agent's earlier confidence had vanished, replaced by panic and regret. She kept glancing at the boy, her expression a mix of guilt and disbelief. Meanwhile, the boy stood quietly, wiping away his tears. For the first time since this nightmare began, he felt a flicker of hope. Things weren't okay yet, not by a long shot, but at least someone was finally listening. At least someone believed him. As the supervisor continued talking on the phone, he motioned for the gate agent to step aside. They huddled together, speaking in hushed tones. Occasionally, the supervisor would glance back at the boy, his expression softening slightly. It was obvious that damage control was underway, but the boy couldn't help feeling angry. Why had it taken this long for anyone to take him seriously? Why had they assumed the worst about him just because he was young and didn't look like someone who belonged in first class? Eventually, the supervisor hung up the phone and walked back over to the boy. His demeanor was apologetic, almost sheepish. "We're very sorry about this," he said, his voice low. "There's been a misunderstanding, and we're going to make sure you're taken care of properly." The boy nodded silently, still processing everything that had happened. He wanted to feel relieved, but the sting of humiliation lingered. Even though he knew he hadn't done anything wrong, the way people had treated him had left a mark. Those judgmental stares, those muttered comments, they weren't easy to forget. Within minutes, managers appeared, rushing to smooth things over. They apologized profusely, promising that the issue would be resolved immediately. Someone handed the boy a brand new ticket, this one printed fresh and crisp with his name clearly marked on it. Another employee escorted him to the front of the boarding line, ensuring he wouldn't face any further delays. Despite the apologies and attempts to make amends, the gate agent remained visibly shaken. Her earlier certainty had crumbled, replaced by shame and regret. She avoided looking directly at the boy, instead focusing on her computer screen, as if trying to disappear into it. It was clear that she hadn't expected this outcome, and neither had anyone else. By the time the boy boarded the plane, word of the incident had spread throughout the terminal. Passengers whispered about it as they waited to board, sharing snippets of what they'd seen or heard. Some expressed outrage on the boy's behalf, while others simply shook their heads in disbelief. For the boy, though, none of that mattered anymore. What mattered was that he was finally getting the experience his dad had promised him, an experience he had earned, not because of where he came from or what he looked like, but because he deserved it. As he settled into his seat, the boy let out a long sigh. The journey ahead was still uncertain, but one thing was clear. He had learned something valuable today. Standing up for yourself isn't always easy, especially when the world seems determined to doubt you. But sometimes, having faith in who you are and knowing there's someone in your corner is all it takes to turn things around. The moment the boy stepped onto the plane, it was like entering a completely different world. The chaos and tension of the airport faded away as he crossed the threshold into the first-class cabin. Everything around him seemed bigger, softer, and more luxurious than anything he'd ever experienced before. The seats were wide and plush, covered in smooth leather that felt cool to the touch. There was so much space between them that he could stretch out his legs without bumping into anything, or anyone. It was nothing like the cramped economy section he'd seen in movies or heard about from friends. A flight attendant greeted him with a warm smile, her voice gentle and welcoming. "Welcome aboard," she said, guiding him to his seat. She helped him settle in, showing him how to adjust the seat, where to find the entertainment system, and even offering him a drink before takeoff. For the first time that day, the boy felt truly valued. He wasn't just another passenger. He was someone who mattered. But even as he soaked in the luxury around him, the events at the gate kept replaying in his mind. No matter how comfortable the seat was or how friendly the staff acted, he couldn't shake off the memory of being humiliated in front of strangers. The way the gate agent had torn up his ticket, the look on her face when she accused him, felt branded into his thoughts. And then there were the whispers from the crowd, those judgmental stares that made him feel like he didn't belong. He tried to push those feelings aside and focus on the present. After all, this was what his dad had worked so hard for, to give him an experience he would never forget. But the truth was, he wouldn't forget this trip for reasons neither of them could have predicted. As the plane taxied down the runway, the boy stared out the window, watching the ground grow smaller and smaller until it disappeared beneath the clouds. The view was breathtaking, but his mind kept drifting back to the incident. Why had the gate agent reacted the way she did? Was it because of how he looked? Because he was young? Or was it something else entirely? At first he thought maybe she had been having a bad day. Everyone has moments when they're stressed or distracted, right? But deep down he knew it wasn't that simple. If he were honest with himself, he suspected it had something to do with assumptions. Assumptions people make without even realizing. Assumptions based on appearances, on stereotypes, on things that don't really matter, but somehow shape how we see each other. The boy sighed softly, leaning back in his seat. He didn't want to think about it anymore, but the thoughts refused to leave him alone. Instead of letting them overwhelm him, though, he decided to channel them into something productive. Maybe someday, he thought, he could use this experience to help others. To speak up for people who might not have a voice, or who are judged unfairly because of things they can't control. By the time the plane reached cruising altitude, the boy's mood had shifted slightly. The initial sting of humiliation was still there, but it was softened by a newfound sense of determination. He realized that while he couldn't change what had happened, he could decide how he responded to it, and he chose to respond with strength, not bitterness. The flight attendants continued to check on him throughout the journey, bringing him snacks and drinks, making sure he was comfortable. Each interaction reminded him of how different this experience was compared to earlier at the gate. Here he wasn't treated like an outsider. He was treated like a guest, a valued one. It made him wonder why such kindness couldn't be extended to everyone, regardless of their circumstances. When mealtime came, the boy was amazed by the spread laid out before him. There were options he'd never even heard of, dishes served on real plates with actual silverware. Nothing about this experience felt ordinary. Yet, as he ate, he found himself thinking about the people in economy class. What were they eating? Were they comfortable? Did they feel cared for too? It struck him then how divided the world could be, even inside something as small as an airplane, first class versus economy. Those who seemed to belong versus those who didn't. People treated differently based on where they sat, or what kind of ticket they held. It wasn't fair, he thought. Just because someone flew coach didn't mean they deserved less respect or care. Everyone deserved to be treated well, no matter where they came from or what they looked like. As the hours passed, the boy alternated between enjoying the perks of first class and reflecting on everything that had happened. He flipped through the in-flight magazine, watched a movie, and even played a few games on the entertainment system. But no matter what he did, his mind kept circling back to the same questions. Why do people judge others so quickly? And what can be done to change that? By the time the plane began its descent, the boy had come to a quiet resolution. He didn't have all the answers yet, but he knew one thing for sure. He wanted to make a difference. Not just for himself, but for others who might find themselves in similar situations. Whether it was through speaking up, sharing his story, or simply treating people with kindness, he vowed to do his part to create a world where no one felt small or unimportant because of someone else's assumptions. When the plane finally touched down, the boy gathered his belongings and prepared to disembark. As he stepped off the aircraft, he took a deep breath, feeling a mix of emotions. Gratitude for the journey, frustration over the challenges he'd faced, and hope for the future. He didn't know exactly what lay ahead, but one thing was certain. This trip had changed him in ways he hadn't anticipated, and maybe, just maybe, it had set him on a path toward something greater than himself. When the plane finally landed, the boy stepped off with a mix of emotions swirling inside him. On one hand, he felt grateful for the experience his dad had given him, a chance to fly first class and see a side of travel he'd never imagined before. But on the other hand, the shadow of what had happened at the gate lingered. It was hard to shake off the memory of being doubted and humiliated in front of strangers. Every time he thought about it, his chest tightened a little. He knew deep down that this wasn't just about him. It was about something bigger. As he walked through the terminal toward baggage claim, he couldn't help but notice how people reacted to him now. Before, when he stood at the gate holding his torn ticket, they had looked at him with suspicion or pity. Some had even whispered behind his back. But now, as he moved confidently through the airport, dressed neatly and carrying himself with quiet pride, their expressions changed. They smiled politely, nodded, or simply went about their business without giving him a second glance. It made him wonder, did they know what had happened? Would they treat him differently if they did? The boy's mind raced with thoughts like these as he waited for his luggage. When his bag finally appeared on the carousel, he grabbed it quickly and headed outside to meet his family. His dad was waiting for him near the pickup area, standing tall and smiling broadly. The sight of his father brought an instant wave of relief. For all the ups and downs of the trip, seeing his dad reminded him that he wasn't alone. Someone believed in him, someone who loved him unconditionally. "Hey, champ," his dad called out, waving enthusiastically. "How was your flight?" The boy hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to answer. Part of him wanted to share everything, the humiliation, the anger, the eventual triumph. But another part of him didn't want to burden his dad with those details. After all, his dad had gone out of his way to give him this amazing opportunity. Why ruin it by dwelling on the bad parts? "It was good," the boy said finally, forcing a small smile. "I liked flying first class." His dad raised an eyebrow, clearly sensing there was more to the story. "Just good?" he asked, his tone playful but probing. "Come on, spill it. What really happened?" The boy sighed, knowing he couldn't hide anything from his dad for long. So, as they drove home together, he told him everything, from the gate agent tearing up his ticket to the crowd whispering about him, and finally to the phone call that turned things around. His dad listened intently, his expression growing darker with each detail. When the boy finished, his dad was silent for a while, gripping the steering wheel tightly. Finally he spoke, his voice calm but firm. "That's not okay," he said. "No one should be treated like that. Not you, not anyone. We're going to make sure this doesn't happen again." The boy nodded, feeling a strange mix of gratitude and guilt. Gratitude because his dad was standing up for him just like he always did. Guilt because he didn't want to cause trouble or make a big deal out of something that was already over. Still, he appreciated having someone in his corner who refused to let injustice slide. Over the next few days, the boy tried to put the incident behind him. He focused on spending time with his family, enjoying the visit and making memories that would last a lifetime. But no matter how much fun he had, the memory of the gate agent's actions and the crowd's reactions kept creeping back into his mind. It gnawed at him, not because he was angry anymore, but because he realized how common experiences like his must be. How many other kids, or adults for that matter, had been treated unfairly because of assumptions based on appearance? How many stories like his went untold? One evening, as he sat with his cousins talking about school and hobbies, the conversation turned to fairness. One of his older cousins mentioned hearing about a kid at her school who got suspended for something he didn't do. Another cousin chimed in, sharing a story about a friend who was accused of shoplifting simply because of the way she dressed. Listening to them, the boy felt a spark ignite inside him. Maybe his experience wasn't unique after all. Maybe it was part of a bigger pattern, one that needed to be addressed. Later that night, lying in bed, the boy stared at the ceiling, thinking about what he could do. He wasn't old enough to change policies or run companies, but he knew he could still make a difference. He could start by speaking up, by telling his story to people who might listen. Teachers, classmates, friends, family. They were all potential allies. If he shared what happened to him, maybe it would inspire others to think twice before jumping to conclusions about someone else. The idea excited him, but it also scared him a little. Sharing his story meant reliving it, which wasn't easy. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized it was worth it. If even one person learned something from his experience, if even one person decided to treat others with more kindness, it would be worth every uncomfortable moment. By the time his trip ended and it was time to head back home, the boy felt different. He wasn't the same kid who had boarded the plane days earlier, full of excitement and innocence. This version of him carried a weight, a responsibility to use what he'd learned for good. As he hugged his relatives goodbye and climbed into the car with his dad, he promised himself that he wouldn't let the experience fade away. He would carry it with him, not as a source of pain, but as fuel for action. On the drive to the airport, his dad glanced over at him and smiled. "You've grown up a lot during this trip," he said softly. "I'm proud of you." The boy smiled back, feeling a surge of determination. He didn't have all the answers yet, but he knew one thing, for sure. This wasn't the end of his story. It was just the beginning. When the boy returned home after his trip, life slowly started to settle back into its usual rhythm. Schoolwork piled up again, chores needed doing, and weekends were filled with family activities. But something inside him had shifted. The experience, at the airport, and everything that followed, had left a lasting impact. It wasn't just about what happened, it was about how he chose to respond to it. At first, the boy kept quiet about his story. He didn't tell his friends or teachers about the torn ticket or the gate agent's accusations. Part of him worried they wouldn't understand, or worse, that they might think he was exaggerating. After all, who would believe that someone could be treated so unfairly over something as simple as a plane ticket? But as days turned into weeks, he found it harder to stay silent. The memory kept bubbling to the surface, urging him to share what he'd been through. One afternoon, during a class discussion about fairness and respect, the boy finally decided to speak up. His teacher had asked the students to talk about times when they felt judged or misunderstood. Most kids shared lighthearted stories like being teased for liking a certain band or getting picked last in gym class. When it was the boy's turn, he hesitated for a moment before raising his hand. "I have a story," he said softly, his voice trembling slightly. "It's not funny, but it made me realize something important." The room fell silent as everyone turned to look at him. Even his teacher leaned forward, clearly curious. Taking a deep breath, the boy began recounting what had happened at the airport. The disbelief on the gate agent's face, the crowd's whispers, the humiliation of having his ticket torn apart. He described the phone call with his dad and the shock that rippled through the terminal when the truth came out. By the time he finished, the classroom was completely still. No one spoke for a few seconds. Then, one of his classmates broke the silence. "That's messed up," she said, bluntly. "Why would anyone treat you like that?" The boy shrugged, feeling a lump rise in his throat. "I don't know," he admitted. "Maybe because I'm young, or maybe because of how I look. All I know is that it shouldn't happen to anyone." His words sparked a lively conversation among the students. Some shared their own experiences of being judged unfairly, while others expressed outrage on his behalf. For the rest of the period, the class talked openly about prejudice, assumptions, and the importance of treating people with kindness. It was one of those rare moments where everyone listened, not just to respond, but to truly understand. Afterward, the boy felt a sense of relief wash over him. Sharing his story hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. His classmates' reactions reminded him that he wasn't alone, that there were people who cared and wanted to help create a better world. Even his teacher pulled him aside later to say how proud she was of him for speaking up. "You've got courage," she told him. "Don't ever lose that." Encouraged by the response, the boy decided to take things a step further. Over the next few months, he began writing essays and giving presentations about his experience. At first, it was just for school assignments, but soon he started sharing his story outside the classroom too. He spoke at community events, youth groups, and even a local library program aimed at promoting empathy and understanding. Each time he told his story, he added new insights, things he'd learned along the way about standing up for yourself, challenging stereotypes, and finding strength in difficult situations. Not everyone reacted positively, of course. Some people dismissed his experience as a one-off incident or accused him of seeking attention. Others argued that the gate agent probably hadn't meant any harm and was just doing her job. Those comments stung, but instead of letting them discourage him, the boy used them as motivation to keep going. If anything, they reinforced why his message mattered. Not everyone would agree with him, but that didn't mean his voice wasn't important. Meanwhile, the airline where the incident had occurred launched an internal investigation. Managers reviewed security footage, interviewed employees, and held meetings to address what had happened. In the end, the gate agent involved kept her job but was reassigned to a position with less customer interaction. The company also implemented mandatory diversity training for all staff members, emphasizing the importance of treating every passenger with dignity and respect. For the boy, these changes were a small victory, but not enough to make him forget the bigger picture. He knew that training sessions and policy updates wouldn't magically erase bias overnight. Real change required more than rules and regulations. It required people to examine their own beliefs and behaviors, and that was something no company handbook could enforce. As time went on, the boy continued traveling with his family, always choosing flights operated by his dad's airline. Each journey reminded him of two things. First, how far he'd come since that fateful day at the gate. Second, how much work still needed to be done to ensure others didn't face similar treatment. Whether he was flying first class or sitting in economy, he carried himself with confidence and grace, determined to lead by example. During one such trip, as he boarded a plane and settled into his seat, a flight attendant approached him with a warm smile. "Welcome aboard," she said cheerfully. "Is there anything I can get for you?" The boy shook his head politely. "No, thank you. I'm good." But as she walked away, he noticed something different about this flight. Something subtle, but significant. Every passenger, regardless of where they sat, was greeted with the same level of care and respect. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. Maybe, just maybe, his story had helped plant a seed of change, not just within the airline, but within the hearts of the people who worked there. By the time the plane took off, the boy felt a renewed sense of hope. He knew the road ahead wouldn't always be smooth, and there would be challenges along the way. But he also knew that every step forward mattered, even the smallest ones. As he gazed out the window at the clouds stretching endlessly below, he reminded himself of the promise he'd made to himself, to use his voice, his story, and his experiences to make the world a little kinder, one person at a time. As the months passed, the boy began to notice something remarkable. His story had started to spread beyond his classroom and community. It was reaching people he'd never even met, friends of friends, teachers from other schools, even strangers on social media had heard about what happened to him at the airport. Some reached out to share their own experiences of being judged unfairly, while others thanked him for speaking up. It amazed him how one moment in his life could resonate with so many different people. One day, during a school assembly, the principal invited him to give a short speech about overcoming challenges. Standing in front of the entire student body, the boy felt nervous but determined. He talked about the incident at the gate, not just as a personal struggle but as a lesson for everyone. "Sometimes people will make assumptions about you," he said, his voice steady despite the butterflies in his stomach. "They might think they know who you are based on how you look or where you come from, but don't let that stop you from showing them who you really are." When he finished speaking, the auditorium erupted into applause. Students clapped and cheered, some even standing up to show their support. Afterward, several kids approached him to say how inspired they were by his courage. One girl told him she'd been teased for wearing hand-me-down clothes and now felt braver about standing up for herself. Another boy admitted he'd been afraid to audition for the school play because he thought people would laugh at him. But after hearing the speech, he decided to give it a try. The boy walked away from that assembly feeling like he'd accomplished something meaningful. Sure, he couldn't fix every problem or erase every unfair judgment in the world. But if his words could encourage even one person to believe in themselves or to treat someone else with more kindness, then it was worth it. Back home, his dad noticed the change in him too. "You've grown so much since that trip," his dad said one evening over dinner. "I'm proud of the way you're handling all this." The boy smiled, feeling a mix of pride and gratitude. "Thanks, Dad," he replied. "But I couldn't have done it without you. You showed me that it's okay to stand up for myself." His dad nodded thoughtfully. "Standing up isn't always easy, but it's important. And remember, it's not just about you. It's about helping others see things differently too." That conversation stuck with the boy. It reminded him that his journey wasn't just about healing from what had happened. It was about using his experience to create positive change. He started thinking bigger. Maybe someday he could write a book or start a campaign to raise awareness about bias and discrimination. For now, though, he focused on the small steps, sharing his story, listening to others, and leading by example. A few weeks later, the airline sent him a letter. It was signed by the CEO, thanking him for bringing attention to an issue that needed addressing. The company had rolled out new training programs designed to promote inclusivity and empathy among employees. They also announced plans to partner with organizations working to combat prejudice in public spaces. While the letter didn't undo the pain of that day at the gate, it gave the boy a sense of closure and hope that real progress was possible. Traveling became a regular part of his life again thanks to his dad's job. Each flight brought its own challenges and opportunities. Sometimes passengers would recognize him and strike up conversations about his story. Other times, he'd overhear comments from fellow travelers about how airlines should treat everyone equally, no matter their seat assignment. These moments reinforced his belief that change was happening, one person, one conversation at a time. On one particular flight, the boy found himself seated next to an older woman who struck up a friendly chat. She asked him about school, his hobbies, and eventually his travels. When the topic turned to the airline, the boy hesitated for a moment before telling her about his experience. To his surprise, she listened intently, nodding along as he spoke. When he finished, she placed a gentle hand on his arm. "You're doing something special," she said softly. "Never underestimate the power of your voice. People need to hear stories like yours." Her words stayed with him long after the flight ended. They reminded him that his efforts weren't wasted, that every time he shared his story, he planted a seed of understanding in someone else's mind. Over time, those seeds could grow into something beautiful. Years later, when the boy grew into a young man, he looked back on that day at the airport with a mix of emotions. The memory still carried a sting, but it was overshadowed by everything he'd gained from it. The experience had taught him resilience, empathy, and the importance of standing up for what's right. More importantly, it had shown him the impact one person can have when they choose to speak up, even if their voice shakes. By then, he'd become a passionate advocate for equality and fairness, using his platform to inspire others. He spoke at conferences, wrote articles, and mentored kids who faced similar struggles. Every step of the way, he carried the lessons he'd learned, not just from the incident itself, but from the people who had supported him along the way. Looking ahead, he knew there would always be challenges to face and battles to fight. But he also knew he wasn't alone. There were countless others out there fighting the same fight, each in their own way. Together, they formed a chain of hope, a reminder that even in a world full of biases and assumptions, kindness and understanding could prevail. And so, the boy who once stood humiliated at an airport gate grew into a man who refused to let injustice go unchallenged. His journey wasn't perfect, and neither was the world around him. But through it all, he held on to one simple truth. Change begins with a single step, and sometimes that step starts with finding the courage to tell your story.